So where we left off was the end of the patriarchs. We have Joseph in Egypt, and then of course his family member meets him in Egypt because of the famine, and they don't realize that's him, but then all is well, and he invites them up, and that's the 12 tribes of Israel that land in Egypt, and then they're in Egypt for the next a few hundred years. And what happens is, remember, Joseph is second in command to the Pharaoh, so everything is good, but that Pharaoh dies and another Pharaoh comes in and that Pharaoh dies. And it gets to the point where there's a Pharaoh that doesn't really remember the relationship that that Joseph and the Israelites had. And the Hebrews are fertile and they're having lots of babies, and they are filling the land, and it starts to feel threatening to the Egyptians. And so the Pharaoh is like, yeah, we need to cut these numbers a little bit. And so he basically makes an edict that he wants all of the I keep wanting to say handmaidens. What's the word I'm looking for? Like somebody that helps with a delivery, midwife. Thank you. To take the baby boys and throw them in the Nile and kill them so that they can start not having as many Hebrews. Of course, they're enslaved. So, I mean, this is just for a while because they need to have some to be slaves, but not so many that they can like take over and rise up. And right. So that's where we find ourselves. They've been there for something like 400 years, all of the Israelites, and they've been multiplying. And I think when they leave, there's something like the population of Houston that leaves. So it's millions, which is really fascinating. So we are going to go through basically up until now, everything we've been doing is in Genesis, and really no other book of the Bible happened at the same time except probably Job. But right tonight, we're going to go through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, because they all happen not quite at the same time. Exodus happens first, but within Exodus, when Moses goes up and talks to God and has this amazing interaction with the Lord, and he gets the 10 commandments and all that kind of jazz, he also gets information on the law, which is Leviticus. And then when they continue to wander in the desert, which we'll talk about, all the stories of what happens there are in Numbers. And then Deuteronomy is kind of like the State of the Union address that he gives, is given right before they enter the promised land. So Moses and that generation will all be gone, and Joshua and the new generation are about to go in, and that's where we're going to end tonight. So let's see, where are we? Exodus 1:8-11 says, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And then the baby thing comes a little bit later. Where we find ourselves in history is in the late Bronze Age. I think of the books sort of like this, the books that we're going to be covering tonight: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Exodus is the escape from Egypt, and it is the covenant with that Moses makes at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is a big deal. It's also sometimes called Mount Horeb, I think. And a key verse from Exodus that sort of sums up Exodus would be Exodus 22-3. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And that is big time foreshadowing, because the major problem all throughout the biblical narrative and into today is putting other gods before God. And so it's like, God knows that's going to be a problem. And he's like, please don't do that. It's not going to go well for you. Leviticus and Numbers are kind of like divine instructions, and also stories from the wilderness and wandering. A couple key verses from each of those that kind of define them. Leviticus 11:45 is, be holy as I am holy. The whole idea of Leviticus and the law is to live well so that it will go well for you. Now we read Leviticus and we're like, or it seems harsh. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but we're not going to hone in too much on Leviticus. But part of the reason that some of these books of the Bible can sound a little tedious when you're reading them is because they were intended for quite a while to be passed along orally. Oh, who's this? Hello? Oh, it's Timothy. Hi, Timothy. You can grab some food if you want and then head on up. Okay. So it reads that way because it was meant to be orally passed along. So sometimes you'll notice a lot of repetition or details that, I mean, the people then would have cared about in a different way than we do. But okay. Numbers, the key verse I pulled out, which I can pass this along to you guys when we're done, but is the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. It's sort of like a little bit of everything that's going to happen in Numbers. There's going to be a lot of the Israelites making poor decisions in the book of Numbers. Numbers also has a census. That's why it's called that, is they basically take account of all the tribes and who's in them. And probably, to me, that's the most boring part of the whole Bible, is the census. Like, and Dan had 14 sons and they had 7 sons. I mean, I'm glad it's in there because it sets it in, it helps us with time and chronology, and it sets real people and real spaces that you can then go and see how, like, okay, the sons of Noah went like this, and then that's that, and you can follow the thread through. But if you're just reading for funsies, maybe don't start at the beginning of Numbers. Okay. And then lastly, Deuteronomy, like I said, is told on the doorstep of Canaan. Canaan is the land that is, we think of as the Holy Land now. I'm doing this because in my mind, I'm like picturing Israel, but you guys are like, what is this? This is Canaan. And it's the land that would one day be theirs. God tells them it's flowing with milk and honey. I heard Chris C. at Ecclesia gave a sermon one time, and he's like, milk and honey doesn't sound that great to us, but think about it. Milk is queso, it's ice cream, and anyway, and then he's like, and honey is like baklava, and he's like saying all these things, and I'm like, oh man, that's true. But those words just would have meant to them a land of abundance and plenty, and like where you want to go on vacation, you know. And my key verse for Deuteronomy is, and maybe this will sound familiar to you if you've read the New Testament recently, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. That's from Deuteronomy. So when in the New Testament, somebody, you'll note they're asked, like, what's the greatest commandment? They hearken back to this from Deuteronomy, and that's where it is. Okay, so things that are happening just in the world outside the Bible. If you want to like have some archaeological evidence for some of the things we're talking about, Google the Amarna letters. Has anybody ever heard of the Amarna letters? Amarna. They're a set of tablets in like cuneiform, I think, that were part of the royal archive of Amenhotep IV, also called Akhenaten. They were correspondence written between Egypt and representatives of Canaan and some of the surrounding lands. They're mostly about trade stuff and war. But because of them, it puts a lot of things in place for historians, which is really cool. So you can actually go and read like obviously you can't read cuneiform, but you know, they've translated them, and you can read the back and forth letters. And it's interesting because it'll be like, send supplies for such and such. And you're like, oh, that corresponds with what we know to be true, but, you know. Egypt is king at this point. So in all of those civilizations that we talked about around all the river valleys of the world and then out and around into Peru, the Egyptian dynasty that we are in this time, they're thriving. Egyptian armies had marched through Palestine into Syria. They clashed with the Hurrians or Hurrians. I don't know how you say that, but I've been listening to a lot of podcasts about them. They say it both ways, which are part of Mitanni, which is modern Iraq and or Babylon. That one gets a lot of names. The Mitanni Empire ruled Assyria, which later will be a major force for us to reckon with as Bible people, and lasted until the reign of Shalmaneser I of Assyria. The two big Mesopotamian civilizations that will come back to bite Israel later are really starting to make their splash on the world scene, one more than the other. The first is Old Babylonian or Amorite dynasties, again, modern day Iraq. And just starting to come on the scene during the time we're talking about tonight is the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They're going to get kind of kicking off a little bit later, but both of those later are going to come back to take over Israel. Spoiler. Egypt is in its new kingdom. And they've gotten rid of the Hyksos. We talked about them right at the end last time. They were sort of an annoying people. And this is a period of like prosperity, renaissance in art, massive building projects, increased foreign trade, and they're just doing really well. Egypt is doing really well. Some of the other civilizations are as well, partly because they're in trade with Israel. So, okay, so we find ourselves with all the baby boys having to be thrown into the Nile. And you probably remember the story of baby Moses. His mom disobeys the rule, but not really, actually, because she does put him in the Nile. She puts him in a basket in the Nile. Fun fact, the word that's used for the basket that Moses is in, does anyone remember from this? I've told you guys this fun fact before. It's only used, that word for that basket, it's only used one other time in the Bible, and it's the word for the ark. So it's to save God's like righteous people for his purposes in water. or from water. And so put in the Nile is found by the daughter of the Pharaoh, which we are practically positively sure is Hatshepsut, which we talked about in one of our former ones I showed you guys, the mummy. I'll tell you guys this, like the string of it later, because I have to read it off the paper. But basically, there was a really young pharaoh, and she was the half sister that they married them together, which is super gross, but they did, and to like strengthen the dynasty. But because she was older, she basically ran the ship, and she is considered a queen of Egypt, and she did a really good job. But because she has ties to Moses, we don't know that this is the reason, but biblical scholars think this is the reason. Her name is scratched out of a lot of tablets and like shrines and places where it would have been written, and you can see the remainder of it, but it's scratched out, which kind of lends credence to the biblical story. Like, people are pissed off at her for bringing this like interloper, this Hebrew, into Egyptian land, and then of course he mucked everything up, right? Okay. So he grows up in Egypt, some in royalty, some with his Hebrew mom and sister. But he would have known the ways of Egypt, and he would have known all about their gods and all that kind of stuff. But he is Hebrew, and he knows, and he has an affinity for his own people. And of course, maybe you know the story, but when he's a young man, he sees, well, young man in Bible terms, he's 40. So he sees one of the Hebrew slaves being beaten, and he is enraged, and to defend him, he ends up killing the Egyptian shoulder, and he buries him. He realizes later that somebody has seen it, so he flees, and he goes to Midian. Midian is an interesting little like character on the world scene, because up until a couple books away from where we are now, the Midianites are friendly to the Israelites. So much so, I mean, he marries into the family of Jethro, who's a priest, and then he lives. So Moses's life is in 40-year chunks. It's like 40 years in Egypt, 40 full years being married, working for his father-in-law, being a shepherd, just being a happy guy out in the country. It's like, you know, when your friends move to Brenham, that's for the Neils if you're watching. And then 40 years, he'll be in the desert. So 40, 40, 40, that's kind of interesting. Jesus was in the desert for 40 days and nights, just putting that out there. Anyway, let's see. So he's in Midian, he's doing that. I'm skipping some of the other stuff because I want to get time for our discussion. But if you want to know more about what's happening in the world, I'll send you this document. So then we get, when he comes out of Midian, or when he's in Midian, he has this encounter with the Lord at the burning bush. You guys have heard this story. By the way, if anyone has the opportunity to go to the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., you have to go to the like immersive 30-minute walk through. It's like a walk through the Old Testament exhibit, and they do all of these stories somehow in 30 minutes. Like, I can hardly tell you this in whatever I have, like 20, but and it's amazing. So check it out. Okay. But God speaks to him in there, and he says, I'm going to have you rescue our people, the Israelites that I made this covenant with, from Egypt. And he's like, no, I have a stutter. No, I'm happy here, whatever. And, you know, God does a variety of miracles in that moment. And that's where he says, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And then he's like, but I can't do it by myself. And so God says, fine. You know, your brother Aaron can go with you, because we think that Moses maybe had a stutter. So Aaron goes with them, and they work as a team, but Moses is still the head guy. So as you know, they go back to Egypt and they confront Pharaoh. I think it's Amenhotep II. There are two big theories about when the Exodus happened, for those who think that it happened. If you like this kind of stuff and you want to nerd out on it, there's a documentary on Netflix, part of the Patterns of Evidence series, and it's like called the Exodus, I think. I don't know. You can Google it. And they talk about how there's an early date and a late date. Both have like some clues that point to them, but the early date matches up with so much more of the archaeology that they found, and really fits with like rulers and things. And so some people believe it's like Ramses II. Some people believe it's Amenhotep II. I'm in the early camp. And so I'm basing all of my numbers tonight on the early date, which is 1446. Okay, nerd part over. But so he goes to Pharaoh, and he demands that Pharaoh let the Israelites go, which is just a joke. I mean, it would be like going to some country where they have a bunch of enslaved people, be like, yeah, we're going to take all those slaves. And be like, no. And then, there's like this back and forth with like God showing some miracles with the staff and snakes and that kind of thing. And then their magicians kind of do the same. For each of these stories, there's so many cool stories within the stories that I want to tell you guys. And I want to like point to all these little things, but we are doing big picture tonight. So I'm resisting. But all throughout this process, it keeps talking about Pharaoh's heart being hard. And then sometimes it talks about God hardening Pharaoh's heart, which is hard for us to read because we're like, well, that doesn't sound fair. We could talk another time more about the theology behind that. But the interesting thing is, and the original readers would have known this, in Egypt, the job of the pharaohs was to keep something called Ma'at, which is, it's M-A'-A-T, which is from the goddess Ma'at, which is, she's over like cosmic order and truth and justice and righteousness. And so the whole narrative, the ongoing narrative of Pharaoh and his heart is a big nod to this idea that Pharaoh was not only supposed to keep Ma'at, keep justice for his people, but he was also the standard of it, which that should sound familiar to us because he's viewed as a king who's the standard of goodness and justice. We of course think of that being God, who's the true king and the standard of truth and justice, not some guy, right? Who's like whim goes one way and the next, as we see in one story. But this is where, so the Ma'at thing is, we know this from the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, that in the judgment scene, the heart of the pharaoh, the mummified heart, would be weighed on a scale against this feather that represented righteousness and justice to see if it was heavier than the feather. Just very silly. But anyway, and so the hard heart really is more about a heavy heart. So that's what it's talking about. It says his heart is hard. It doesn't mean it was like, oh, I don't want to be in a relationship anymore. It was like a heaviness that wouldn't do well in the afterlife. And the pharaoh was responsible for his people and their ma'at. And this is also why scarabs would be wrapped in mummies and placed over the heart, because they were supposed to protect it in the afterlife, because they dig through dung and they keep things fresh. I don't know. So that when the heart was weighed by Anubis, which is god of the underworld, it would be like fresh. Anyway, so that's what's happening with all the hardening of the heart. So then we get the 10 plagues. You guys might remember the 10 plagues: water to blood, frogs, gnats, on and on and on. All of the things that God is using to make his point. And when you're a little kid and you learn about the plagues, they sound harsh and they sound random. But what you learn, if you hang out with me long enough, or somebody else that's studying this kind of stuff, is each of the plagues was like trash talk to one of their existing gods. So they had a god of water. They had a god of fly. Truly, there was a god that had a fly head. And I've brought pictures of these from like paintings and like cave art and stuff that you can look at and see. It's really gross, but it's like God is saying, you think this God is powerful? You think this God will save you? No, Yahweh is so much more powerful. Yahweh is the one true God who controls this thing. And then Pharaoh keeps going, oh, okay, take him. No, don't take him. And of course, the last one is the plague of the firstborn. And I hate that it got to this, but God said, I am going to send the angel of death and kill all the firstborn. Kids, adults, cattle, like any firstborn. So this isn't just babies dying. This is grown people. Like I would have been dead. I'm a firstborn. Any other firstborns in the house? Okay. Wow, I attract firstborns. So Amelia and Sarah, y'all are on your own if we have another. But don't worry, because there was a provision that God put in place for anyone that would do this. And this is not just for Israelites. It's anyone that would obey God and do this. Because we know that when the Israelites left, that there were Egyptians that were not Hebrew that left with them, which is pretty cool. I mean, it's like a little tag along in the Bible. You have to make sure you read that verse. But God is always inviting other people into his family to be adopted in. I mean, that story goes all the way through, right? We get to be adopted in. We're not Israelite either. I don't think any of you guys are Jewish. So, but of course, Passover, is it there to slaughter a lamb and take the blood of the lamb on a hyssop branch, which is the same thing they use when they give it to Jesus on the cross, and to put the lamb's blood over the door. And that way the angel of death will pass over them. That's where we get the name Passover. And of course, that story is rich with symbolism about the crucifixion, right? Because God eventually is the lamb that dies for us and his blood protects us from death. It's awesome. I mean, so that happens. And finally, Pharaoh is so distraught, probably because his firstborn died, that he lets them go. And, the let my people go song. Anyway, so the people go, y'all know the song. We can sing it if you want at the end. Anyway, and so they go, but of course, Pharaoh once again changes his mind. And after they've been gone for a while, realizes, what have I done? We have no slave labor now. Like, how are we going to be a thriving economy? And so he sends all these chariots and an army after them. And that's where we get, you fast forward and we get to the, so they're following the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And they get to the Red Sea. A lot of controversy about the Red Sea. Is it the Sea of Reeds? Is it the Red Sea? And if you look at a map today of the Red Sea, you'll see it's like the Sinai Peninsula here, and then the Red Sea is big here, and it has like smaller channels up here, which when you're there in real life, it'd still be big enough that it looks like an ocean, but it's not like the Atlantic Ocean or something. I believe, because I'm going to take the Bible at its word, unless I'm proved wrong from something else. And even then, I think that science and archaeology will always point to the Bible being true. But the Bible talks about that there were walls of water on either side of them. And that after they passed through, millions of people, many millions of people, and they're like horses, anything they could take with them, right? They pass through this, and then it comes back down on the Egyptian army and destroys them. Chariots. So some people are like, well, the chariots got stuck in the mud. Okay. Anyway, I believe it really happened. And I don't think it needed to be like the whole Pacific Ocean or something, but it was enough that there were walls of water on either side, and it was miraculous, and it saved them. And them coming out and through the Red Sea is the pinnacle event of the Old Testament. And it's what God and prophets, when they talk, they always come back to, I am the God who saved you from your time in Egypt. I am the God who brought you through the Red Sea. I am the God who brought you from Pharaoh, whatever. It is the big salvation moment of the Old Testament. And so it's again doing some more foreshadowing for the big salvation moment in the New Testament, which is where, they're saved from slavery in Egypt. We are saved from the slavery of sin, and we get to escape death into life. Okay. So, but then there they are in the desert, and they're not wandering yet. At this point, they think they're going straight shot to Canaan. We're going to do a quick stop at Mount Sinai, get some rules. And they don't know that, but when they do come out of the Red Sea, there's a really cool poem/song, which is a song of Miriam, Moses and Miriam, but mostly Miriam sing the song. She's a prophetess. She and Deborah and Hannah and somebody else that I can't remember are the only ones that sing songs that are like published in the narrative of the Bible, and they're all women. Pretty cool. Deborah gets a whole chapter of Judges where she sings her song after her counterpart drives a tent peg through a guy's head, but that's for another day. Okay, so they're in the desert, and then they just encounter all of these obstacles, and God walks them through each one. They find a place where the water tastes bitter, and God changes it to sweet. They are hungry, so God sends them manna. You guys know that it falls, and he tells them not to take more than they need. And then they're like, oh, we don't like the manna. He's like, how about quail? So they get quail for a while. I was listening to some sermon, and the guy's like, and quail's delicious. Like, sure, but like for a while. Then they do the water from a rock thing. There's a weird battle that happens here with the Amalekites. The Amalekites are another annoying pest that don't like the Israelites. They, because and I say they're annoying, and they're like, they fight in bad form, because it talks about how they came up behind the caravan to pick off the weak. So like the older people, the sick people, the handicapped, women, children, like, just don't be like that, And so there's this story in the Bible, which my sister and I sometimes refer to this when we talk about like supporting each other. There's a battle where Joshua and his army are fighting the battle with the Amalekites that they do win, but they realize Moses is holding up his arms, and they realize that as long as he's holding up his arms, they're winning. And when he puts his arms down, they start to lose. And so he holds them up, but they start to get tired. And so Aaron and Hur, H-U-R, hold his arms up. And it's just it's kind of a weird story, but it's also kind of a cool story about like, sometimes, even if you're the guy who's brought people out of Egypt, you need some people to hold your arms for victory to happen. So sometimes my sister and I will talk about like, do you need someone to like just hold up an arm? Yes. Okay, they get to Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is both a literal and very sort of rich symbolic place, because mountains in the Bible are often about meeting the gods. I mean, you remember with the ziggurat, they're trying to get up, 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 up to the gods. High places get you up to God. Low places are far away from God. They viewed mountains as like where heaven and earth meet. Let's see, some people thought that deities actually lived on the peak of a mountain, and so they would build temples and altars there. Of course, the Israelites were told that's not how that works, but they did have this. At the base of Mount Sinai, there was like thunder and fire and smoke and trumpets, and it was like an event where God like showed up. They didn't see him, but they were like aware of his presence. So Moses goes up, he's told to go up, and he has a long encounter with the Lord where he gets the 10 commandments, other laws. God tells him about the tabernacle, which I'll tell you about in a second. And while he's up there, and that's when he comes down and his face is shining so much that people have to shield their eyes because he has like the glory of the Lord left over on him. But while he's up there, does anybody remember what happens? Golden calf. Yes. So Aaron, in a really like just bad season. I don't know like what is happening with this guy, but they build an altar. And it's interesting because I think we think of that being an altar to a false god. They do build it to God, but they use the image of an Egyptian god, Apis, the bull god. So they model it after an Egyptian god, but they are thanking their god and worshiping it. So it's like trying to mix two things, that syncretism we talked about. And it's very misguided, but and they get in trouble, and we're not going to get into that because we have so much else to cover. But while he's up there, God tells Moses the 10 commandments. When he comes back down and the golden calf thing happens, he's so angry, he breaks them. So he has to get a fresh set. But anyway, he also learns about the tabernacle, which I'm not going to get super into, but a lot of Exodus, like the whole second half of Exodus, is all the details about the tabernacle. The tabernacle is a traveling giant tent with lots of different parts and rooms and setups and special things, sacred things. And it's the place where in the heart of it, the Holy of Holies, is where the Ark of the Covenant will be. And that's where God is going to actually reside in some strange and sacred, mysterious way. God, who's always with them in some sense, and he's always around and he's ever present, but in this very sort of like personal present way, is going to put his presence in the tabernacle. It's very similar to the language that's used in the Garden of Eden. In fact, there's all kinds of literature written about the Garden of Eden is the first tabernacle/temple. And so you have the Garden of Eden, let me do this from your perspective. Garden of Eden is the first one. And then you have the tabernacle. And then Solomon will build the temple. And then that'll get torn down and rebuilt and torn down. And then in the New Testament, where does God reside? But where? In us. So we are the temple. So it goes Garden of Eden, tabernacle, temple, us, our hearts, or whatever, however you want to view that. So that's very cool. So all of the stuff about the tabernacle is rich with symbolism. If you read through it without kind of knowing how it all fits with their current culture and the foreshadowing for things, it can read really dry and boring. But I will tell you the 3 things that they kept in the Ark of the Covenant. I've lost all my notes, but maybe I can remember. No, we're getting to that later. That's not till they're in exile. Is the 10 commandments, the tablets, a jar of manna. I didn't remember that until doing this. I think it's interesting that they are trying to remember God's provision in that way. Sweet. And the staff of Aaron, I think. Well, I'll find it later, but I think that's right. So he gets all those instructions, comes down, calf, goes back up, comes back down. And we're not going to get into that, but that's the bulk of Exodus, and also is talked about. All of the law that he gets, that's Leviticus. Leviticus means law. And so, and you learn some more about how the tribes are going to be broken down, and like the Levites are going to be the priests and this and that. We don't have time for that tonight. Anyway, at this point, they decide to send 12 spies into the new land. So they've been here a little bit, not too long, and they're going to check it out. They're going to come back and report, and then they're going to move into their new home. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. The 12 spies go in and they come back. And does anybody remember what they report? There's giants in the land. We can't defeat them. We're like grasshoppers to them. 10 of the 12 say this. They say we cannot win. which is just so interesting because God told them, I'm going to take you into there. And he just brought them out of this impossible situation with like miracle on miracle on miracle on mighty act on top of mighty act. And they're like, I don't think we can do this, which is so puzzling because it's like the same God that brought you out of Egypt is saying he's going to go ahead of you and do this thing. But because you've had so little faith and you didn't trust me, I'm going to wait until there's a generation of people who will trust me. And so Joshua and Caleb were the two spies that said, no, I think we can do this. So they get to take the people into the land in 40 years, but they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. They have the tabernacles, that's good. And they have their ways of doing sacrifices and all that kind of jazz. But they are just a wandering, sad people. And that generation dies out and they come into a generation where you have Joshua as the head. Moses doesn't even get to go into the promised land, except in the New Testament, in the Transfiguration, Moses shows up and it's in the promised land. So there's a little loophole there for Moses. Okay, so 40 years of wilderness wandering. We think if you use my date for the Exodus, not like I made it up, but 1446 to 1406. In that time, things are happening in the world. You've got wars between the Egyptians and the Hittites. The Hittites are the people of Anatolia, which is Turkey. The Hittites are kind of fascinating. I started doing some research on them today. I don't want to get into it for time's sake, but yeah, you should explore the Hittites for fun. The Mitanni Empire is recovers all of northern Syria from Egypt. So they're really growing. That's Iraq. The new kingdom of the Hittites, like I just said, starts up. And let's see. We've got all the early civilizations we already talked about around the river valleys. So the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley is the modern day Iraq. The Nile River Valley is Egypt, going strong and continues to go strong, except they did take a hit after the Exodus, where there's a marked difference in their army and very little reported until like a pharaoh or two later, which is interesting. The Yellow River Valley is up in China. They'll kind of start to make their play in a bit. The Indus River Valley would be Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. And in this time, they're interesting because they're enough separate from all of what we're talking about that they're really not messed with. Like they're doing some trading, but they're protected, I think, by some mountains or something. So they're not really in the whole like warring factions between, the Mesopotamian area and like Canaan and Egypt and that whole like sort of triangle. India or like northern India really kind of stays out of that. In fact, they are the first in this time to grow cotton for the production of cloth. Kind of cool. And then they have a people there, the Harappan people, who kind of like mysteriously disappear. And there are different theories about why they do, and no one really knows. Sort of like the dinosaurs of people. Like, anyway. So that is all of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then in Deuteronomy, basically it's just that's where they say like, choose you this day who you will serve. As for me and my family, will serve the Lord. And then there's just a long list. I've been losing my voice, or I haven't gotten it back. There's a long list of, if you do things this way, you will be blessed. If you don't do them this way, you will be cursed. And cursed doesn't mean like, a curse on your whole family. It's like, it won't go well for you because you're not going to follow the rules I'm giving you. Either if you are a mom or you have a mom and dad, that like parents, for the most part, good parents, give their kids rules to make their lives good and better. And when the kids follow those rules, it goes well for them. Like I said this example on Sunday that like Timothy's on his way home and he calls me and he's like, I'm going to get Taco Bell for dinner. I'm like, well, if you just wait till you get home, I'm going to make you Korean ribs and blah, blah, blah. That's what I made the other night. It's a better thing if you will like do it my way. You can eat your crap, but it just won't be as good. And like later you'll be in the bathroom like, why did I eat that Taco Bell? And so that's what Deuteronomy is. It's like, don't eat the Taco Bell, like have the good stuff, do the good stuff. And then Leviticus has a bunch of rules about like sexuality, which interestingly enough, we think of Leviticus being like the big bad wolf when it comes to LGBTQ stuff. But in the list of sex rules, and I think it's like 17 of them, 1 through 16, let me mute that. 1 through 16 are all things we could like all get on board with. It's like, do not have sex with your aunt. She is your aunt. Do not have sex with your mother-in-law. She is your mother-in-law. It always says the thing afterwards, like, do not have sex with your brother. He is your brother. Like, clear things that I think all of us are like, yeah, like that seems like it makes sense. And then the very last one is do not have sex, a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. And that's where people are like, oh, what? And we're not going to get into that tonight. I just think that's interesting that like we're on board with all the other stuff. But I will say also that the Levitical law seems harsh to us. But if you compare it to the codes at the time, we talked a little bit about Hammurabi last time, but Hammurabi's code was very punitive. So if somebody like, I can't remember the exact one. I've taught on this before, but it's been a long time. If somebody, did something where you lost your hand, then you could kill that person. And the Bible's like, whoa, how about just hand for a hand? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And so that mentality, we think that sounds so harsh, but it's taking where they are in their culture and it's taking a huge step forward in law code. And of course, that will continue on into the New Testament where God's like, hey, you've heard it said not to murder, but I'm telling you, if you're angry in your heart, that counts. You're like, oh my gosh, like that keeps stepping it up to this gentler and gentler, more merciful, forgiving space. But anyway, so that's Leviticus. We talked about Numbers. Deuteronomy is the State of the Union address. For tonight's story that I want to hone in on, though, is when the Israelites are in the wandering, in the wilderness. I figure since it's our last one in the late Bronze Age, we should talk about something bronze. Does anybody know the story I'm going to talk about based on that? Okay. Yes, snakes. Okay. So there's this story where the Israelites, they do this thing 13 times in one book. They complain and grumble. And I think when the Bible says complain and grumble, they don't mean like, oh man, hope tomorrow will be better. It's like they're getting their factions of people and going to Moses and like, this has got to stop. And they'll say things like, take us back to Egypt. Can you imagine saying, take us back to slavery? Like, take us back to this place where we were like second-class citizens. That would be better than being here. And so on and on, they keep saying, did you bring us out here to die? And over, the Lord is sustaining them, but they're so upset with him and they're grumbling. And different things happen in different times when they disobey. But in this particular case, they're like, we want to go back to Egypt. We want Egypt. So God goes, you want a taste of Egypt? I'll give you a taste of Egypt. And he sends a bunch of snakes in there. The deal with snakes is, I think a lot of people are like, oh, snakes are bad because of Satan. And that's true. And they are bad. But snakes in this story really are a just big symbol of Egypt. Ancient Egyptians love their snakes. A favorite was like the rearing cobra, with like that distinctive like hood spreading back. The pharaoh would wear a headdress resembling the cobra's hood for protection and as a symbol of royalty. So it's interesting because they're like, well, we want to go back to Egypt. And God says that symbol that you thought protected you, I'm now going to send you and show you that it actually brings death. Like when you complain against the Lord and when you don't trust me, that's when you invite death in. So these venomous snakes come in and they're biting the people and people are dying. And so they go to Moses, oh, we're so sorry. We shouldn't have complained. Can you save us? And God tells Moses to make a bronze snake. And it's bronze. Why? Because it's the Bronze Age. Like that's the tools they had at their disposal. They had tin and they had copper and they could smelt them together and make bronze. So they made this bronze snake on a pole, which is to this day, the medical symbol. The pole with the snakes at the top, like that's where that comes from, is this story. And the deal is if you go and look at that, you will be healed. I think it's interesting that it doesn't say look and believe, look and say a prayer, look and make a sacrifice. Just look at it. Just put your eyeballs on it. So let's see. I might read just a little bit of this story. I've gotten all my papers mixed up here. Where am I? Okay. So let's see. If you are following along, this is in Numbers 21. I'll start in verse 4. It says they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea. A lot of times they talk about the Red Sea because they're winding around along the Red Sea. So it's not probably where they crossed over. It's probably much further south where they're along the coast of the like wider part. Okay. To go around Edom because, those were bad guys. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread. False. There's no water. Also false. We detest this miserable food. Like cranky teenagers. I love when I make my kids something delicious and they're like, I don't like it. I'm like, that's like pork belly or whatever. Anyway, then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people and many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, we sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us. So Moses prayed for the people. The Lord said to Moses, make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live. So Moses made a bronze snake and put it on a pole. Then when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. I think I'm trying to picture, like, what would it be like if I, you can do the same little thought experiment, lived there. You're like in your tent with your kids and your husband or whatever. And, the snake thing's happening. And so everyone's like running inside their tent, zipping up their tent, like it has a zipper, but, and they're like watching the sort of exit points for snakes, and maybe like one comes in and you kill it. Maybe another one comes in, you kill it, but they're coming too fast and too many, and one bites your children. And you're lamenting, you're like, what are we going to do? And a neighbor comes over and says, like, hey, did you hear that all you have to do is go look at the bronze snake that Moses made? It's like in the middle of camp. Just go look at that and you'll be healed. I'm just imagining like the thought process that would go through different people's heads, because some people will be like, it does not make sense. Like scientifically, logically, I'm not going to do that. Right. Because there's a faith element. It's a ridiculous thing. It is meant to be illogical and kind of ridiculous so that you have to be like, okay, I guess I'll just trust God, and maybe somebody else will be like, I think we'll be okay on our own. Like, I think if we could just we'll use a salve, we'll suck the poison out, whatever, we'll do something that we think will work. But of course we know that wouldn't work. The only thing that's going to work is if they swallow their pride and they do this crazy thing and they look at the bronze snake. Of course, this story parallels the human condition, right? Because of our sin, we are under the curse of death, but God provides the remedy. And as if it wasn't so obvious, when we fast forward to the New Testament, Jesus himself is like, let me reiterate the story about the snakes when he's talking to Nicodemus. In the most famous verse of all the Bible that you probably all memorized at some point, whether you're a believer or not, you memorize John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son, right? That verse comes right after, is as part of the conversation with Nicodemus, Nicodemus was a scribe or a Sanhedrin, who was like a top level religious official who would have known all of this stuff that I'm telling you guys tonight in way more detail than we've gone into it. But he comes to Jesus in the dead of night and he's like, but like, how? Like, what do I need to do to be saved? And Jesus kind of explains himself. He's like, but what about this? I don't understand. And when he tells him this story, finally Nicodemus is like, okay. This is in John 3, verse 14. This is Jesus talking. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man, talking about himself, Jesus, must be lifted up on a cross, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. That belief is the same as it was in the desert. It wasn't believe and say a prayer. It was believe that this sort of ridiculous thing that doesn't quite make sense is going to save you from death. Why do you believe it? Because God said so. And that's it. God said, you wanted death? Okay, here's death. But I love you, so I'm not going to leave you in that state. I'm going to provide a way out. Here's the way out. All you have to do is trust me that the same guy that like heard you and gave you what you were asking for also wants to save you. So just do that. And then it also gets mentioned. It's like this like kind of throwaway story in Numbers, but it gets mentioned by Jesus, the head honcho, right? And in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. And he's talking about the people that were in the desert. And he lists some stuff, but then he says, and do not test Christ as some of them did, and they were killed by snakes. So I kind of love this story, even though it's really weird. And at first it kind of seems unfair. Like, well, why would God said snakes? That seems really mean. But you realize the more you read the Bible, that the people of God often get exactly what they ask for. Like later on, they're going to ask for a king. We'll talk about that. And God's like, oh, you don't want a king. Kings get power hungry and it doesn't go well for them or for you. But if that's what you want, I'll give it to you. And that's what happens. Or they ask for, God says, don't worship any other gods but me. Or don't even like marry the women from these pagan lands because they'll seduce you into doing that. And they're like, yeah, but those women are really pretty. And we kind of like that pagan deal. And so they go after it. And so God's like, okay, you want the whole pagan thing? Go, great. And he kind of just pulls back his protection. And then the pagans come in and take them over. And that's what happens all throughout the book of Judges, which we'll get to later. But that is our story. Let's see. Was I going to say anything else about that? I don't think so. So I'm going to stop the recording by YouTube and we're going to discuss, but you don't need to hear everybody's thoughts in the YouTube. So